late spring day in 1921, a 7-year-old black girl named Viola Fletcher went to sleep in her family's home in the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma. She later described that night's sleep as rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, and heritage. Her family had a beautiful home, great neighbors, and she had friends to play with. Just a few hours later, all of that was gone. This is the story of the darkest day in an American town, a day so violent, so devastating, that it was erased from history books for generations. But before we get to the darkness, you need to understand what was lost. In the early 20th century, Greenwood was not just another neighborhood, it was a miracle. Born from the horrors of slavery and the promise of land runs in Oklahoma, this 35-square-block district in North Tulsa had become a self-sustaining economic powerhouse. At a time when Jim Crow segregation laws, adopted immediately upon Oklahoma's statehood in 1907, sought to crush black ambition, Greenwood's residents built their own dream. By 1921, this community was home to roughly 200 black-owned businesses. There were clothing stores, movie theaters, hotels, and grocery stores. Impeccably dressed pedestrians walked bustling streets. Young workers loaded crates of beer onto vans. There were 4 black millionaires living in this district. It was so prosperous that Booker T. Washington himself reportedly called it Black Wall Street. But Greenwood was more than just money. It was a refuge. It was a place where black families could live with dignity in a nation that denied them humanity at every turn. It was, as historian Hannibal Johnson explained, a community of necessity, a response to a world that excluded black people from everything else. And on the night of May 31st, 1921, the world came to destroy it. It started with an elevator. On May 30, a 19-year-old black shoeshine man named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa. He stepped into an elevator operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. Moments later, Page screamed. Rowland ran. To this day, no one knows what actually happened in that elevator. But the next day, the Tulsa Tribune printed a vicious headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." An editorial followed with the chilling title, "To Lynch Negro Tonight." In the Jim Crow South, that headline was a death warrant. By that afternoon, a white mob had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse, demanding that Sheriff Willard McCullough hand Rowland over. The sheriff refused, moving Rowland to the top floor for protection and swearing in extra deputies. But the black men of Greenwood had heard the rumors too. They knew what lynch mobs did. They had seen the photographs. So, around 30 black armed men, including many World War I veterans who had fought for their country in France, drove to the courthouse. They offered their services to the sheriff to help protect Rowland. The sheriff declined, assuring them he had everything under control. By 9:30 that night, the crowd outside the courthouse had swelled to nearly 2,000, mostly white, mostly angry. The small group of black men remained, watching, waiting, refusing to leave a 19-year-old boy to die. Then, a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but once that shot was fired, there was no stopping what came next. The white mob, now armed and inflamed, surged toward Greenwood. But this was not just a spontaneous riot. This was a military-style assault. As the mob advanced, they looted stores, smashed windows, and set buildings on fire. And then, something happened that made this day different from any other in American history. Eyewitnesses reported seeing airplanes, actual aircraft, circling over Greenwood. From those planes, white attackers dropped improvised explosives and blazing balls of turpentine-soaked cotton onto the homes and businesses below. Others fired rifles down into the fleeing crowds. America was bombing its own citizens from the air. Author and historian Scott Ellsworth, who spent decades researching the massacre, described finding photographs of Greenwood after the assault. It just looked like Nagasaki or Hiroshima or Frankfurt, just totally everything gone. George Monroe was just 5 years old when he saw 4 men with torches approaching his house. They walked right past his bed, straight to the curtains, and set them on fire. Monroe hid under the bed with his older sister. When one of the rioters stepped on his finger, his sister clamped her mouth over him to stop him from screaming. He waited 75 years to tell that story. As families fled, the National Guard arrived. But they weren't there to stop the killing. They rounded up thousands of black Tulsans, more than 6,000 at one point, and held them in internment centers at the convention hall and the fairgrounds. The stated purpose was protection. The actual effect was to leave Greenwood completely defenseless while it burned. When the smoke finally cleared on the morning of June 1st, 1921, 35 square blocks of Greenwood lay in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, hospitals, schools, churches, libraries, and businesses gone. As many as 300 black men, women, and children were dead. The Red Cross estimated that more than 10,000 people were left homeless and destitute. 2 weeks later, the Tulsa City Commission issued its official report. Mayor T.D. Evans was unequivocal. Let the blame for this Negro uprising lie right where it belongs, on those armed Negroes and their followers who started this trouble and who instigated it. In other words, the victims were to blame for their own murder. The city passed a new fire ordinance that made it nearly impossible to rebuild with anything but the cheapest materials. They required costly new permits. And when black residents tried to return to their land, insurance companies, which had collected premiums from Greenwood businesses for years, refused to pay a single claim, citing riot damage exclusions. The conspiracy of silence that followed was devastatingly effective. Original copies of that Tulsa Tribune edition disappeared, apparently destroyed. The relevant page is missing even from the microfilm copy. For decades, teachers made no mention of the massacre in schools. No memorials were erected. White families didn't speak of it. Many black survivors, suffering from what we now recognize as PTSD, didn't burden their children with the horror. Scott Ellsworth, who grew up in Tulsa in the 1960s, recalled hearing older adults occasionally lower their voices and whisper about the riot. But when he tried to find out more, he hit walls. Records were missing. Clerks brushed him off. It was almost impossible to find any photographs. When he finally located William D. Williams, a black survivor who had been 16 during the massacre, he found a man who had waited his entire life to tell his story. They talked for 4 hours. Williams connected Ellsworth with other survivors who had never been interviewed before, people who had never spoken about the massacre, even within their own families. It took 75 years for Tulsa to officially acknowledge what happened. In 1997, the state of Oklahoma formed the Tulsa Race Riot Commission to investigate. They found that the city had indeed conspired with the mob against its own black citizens, deputizing some white rioters, providing them weapons, and leaving Greenwood defenseless. In 2001, the commission issued its final report recommending reparations to survivors and their descendants. None of those recommendations were ever implemented. In 2020, a century after the massacre, search teams led by Scott Ellsworth finally located a mass grave in Tulsa's Oaklawn Cemetery. 12 fragile pine coffins containing the remains of massacre victims. For Ellsworth, the discovery brought him back to those early interviews with elderly survivors who had trusted him with their stories. I thought about how happy they would be. I really thought of them. On May 19th, 2021, at 107 years old, Viola Fletcher stood before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C. She told them, "I am 107 years old and have never seen justice." She could still smell the smoke and see the fire. The philosophical. The darkest day in this American town was not just the day it burned. It was every day afterward that the story went untold. Every year the children grew up not knowing why their grandparents flinched at loud noises. Every generation that passed without accountability. The Tulsa Race Massacre is not just a story about what happened on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. It's a story about what happens when a community decides to forget, when a city erases its own history, when justice is delayed for a century and counting. But it's also a story of resilience, because Greenwood rebuilt, not to its former glory, not entirely, but Black Tulsans returned. They planted churches, they opened businesses, they raised families, they told their stories, even when no one was listening. And now, 100 years later, we are finally listening. We are searching for graves. We are erecting memorials. We are teaching this history in classrooms. Because the darkest day in an American town doesn't have to be the last word. The last word belongs to the survivors. The last word belongs to the truth. This is the story of Tulsa, Oklahoma, the day Americans bombed an American city from the air, and the century-long fight to make sure no one ever forgot.